I am so pleased to be here in part because this campus is really quite special. And this campus also has Sharon, who didn't identify herself as one of the co-authors of that book. She and I have written a lot together over the years. We have an hour, right, Sharon? So 1:30. And I am committed to having time at the end for some questions, which means I may bring out my inner New York. I can talk fast. But what it also means is there may be times where I pass over something that you can see on a slide, but I won't go into the details on all this because it's very important that I said earlier today, I want to be useful, which means you need to have permission and time to ask any questions you want. There is nothing as a stupid question, and I want to make sure that we have time for that. So I'm going to wander around a little bit. I'm going to try to honor that this microphone, the video is doing, so I can't go that way. I'll just stay here. The other thing is, and I think we should do this around, Julie suggested we make sure that in the time of the talk, but there's also a time afterward where we can just have an informal conversation, that we pass out some cards or something and just to take notes two ways. One is sort of the questions that come up that you may not have time to ask here, although I hope you'll ask it in the group, but also takeaways. I think the question here is, how are we creating institutional change? And I'm going to look around this room and assume that many of you are quite committed to diversity in higher education. Is that a fair assumption? Can I assume that? Okay. All right. So the key here is taking away. So part of the writing of this is they'll go to Sharon, and that way there's a kind of sense of what do we need to do next. And I'm going to, because the fundamental nature of my talk is about change. How do we create institutional change? I'm going to start with a little humility, and I'm going to ask you, you don't have to raise your, well, yeah, I want you to raise your hand. How many of you know you should exercise more than you do? Good, thank you. That's usually the response. That's the humility exercise, because what it's saying is if I can't get myself, over whom I have total control, presumably, to do something that I know is important, which is exercise, why do we think institutional change will be easy? And that's to allow us to be, to recognize this isn't an easy thing we're setting about doing. And part of my work has been about studying change in higher education with respect to diversity around the country. So I'm an academic, I do research, but my research is field-based. So here, what I'm going to present today is sort of what we've begun to learn for this next generation of work on this topic. And part of it, what I've learned personally, is we've got to find a way to sustain ourselves, because after 50 years of work, there's a little bit of burnout. So this is about diversity's promise, and I've got in here in the title, very intentionally, the notion about how is this an imperative for excellence. Our institutions are about excellence, and nothing anybody who cares about diversity should do is do anything that suggests not excellent. It's just the traditional ways we understand excellence are a bit of a problem. But this is the question of how do we understand this to be an imperative related to excellence? And I hope that's one of the things you'll take away from this. Now, quickly, let me set a context. There's a national and a global context for this. And the first part of this is that we have 50 years of unfinished business with respect to historically underrepresented populations in this country. Latino communities, African American communities, and Native communities. And we cannot, as we move forward, forget that it's unfinished. Because what we tend to do, you'll see in a minute, is we move on. So 50 years of unfinished business for the health and well-being of our society. We've made progress, nobody would dispute that. And now we have expanding domains for diversity, which is going to cause us problems if we're not strategic. So you will recognize all these increasing domains for diversity. The role of religion. After 9/11, we became much more sensitive to Muslim communities on our campuses, right? And what that experience is like in ways that we hadn't. And what was interesting about that moment was we looked around our campuses to see if anybody knew anything about Islam. We had no capacity to have intelligent, informed discussions after the crisis of 9/11. So that's the first time I will use the term capacity. We looked around and said, well, who knows anything? Because we need to know a lot more about Islam if we're going to have conversations. you will recognize these. Sexual orientation, gender identity is one of the newer identities that campuses are engaging with that 10 years ago was not part of our diversity conversation. And thank goodness we're living in a time where we can have that conversation. Disability and ability issues, immigration. We've gone through the next major wave of immigration in the last number of years that has fundamentally transformed every region of the country, including this one. So the days of parts of the country that are only white has pretty well gone, but it's often true that we don't have capacity to know what that means. Indigenous communities, I think there is much more work, attention, solidified conversation about indigenous communities and their future, the viability, and the health and well-being. And every time I come up to the Pacific Northwest, I'm just conscious of how visible that is. I live in Southern California, there's a certain visibility there, but here there's more of a visibility, which has implications for a campus like this. Its mission, so very important. And now, of course, we have internationalization. The next big wave of thing is everything is about global. I've done work as a Fulbright scholar in South Africa, so I don't want anything to be heard as that's not very important, very significant, and very interesting. But it's not the same. Got gender, class, now veteran status. Are you paying attention to veteran status? I assume you are. We now know that none of these identities exist in isolation from the other. And if we're really going to have an understanding of identity, we're going to deal with multiple and intersecting identity. If we were doing a workshop, I'd have you list all your identities. We'd see how they play out in your story. So multiple and intersecting. We now pay attention, for example, to race and gender success for students, because we know there are some communities of men of color that are not doing as well, right? Same with faculty. We may have men of color and white women, but let's see how we're doing with women of color. So multiple and intersecting. And of course, we've got demographic changes in every single state. This is the national, let's see if this is the US population. That's, Black 13%, Latino 17%, Asian 5%, indigenous, you see, small population. Small enough that we can know a lot about small communities. And what we tend to do is just ignore them, which is something we cannot do. So we are already in a very diverse society. And then if you take Tacoma, oh, much more diverse than this. So very important to understand that the demographic changes are with us and are going to help us do this work on diversity. Now the implications are profound. For example, health disparities. We know that if we do not attend well to these diversities in our community, we jeopardize the health and well-being of our society. And it's very clear, and it's manifesting itself in the issues of health and education disparities. The medical community is very concerned about health outcomes, access to health in diverse communities. Educational disparities cannot continue if we expect to have a vibrant, healthy democracy that works. What the political scientists tell us is the more disparities you have, the less stability you have in a society. So unless we want to live in the world that other people are living in, we can just keep doing what we're doing. We've got huge, huge demands now for what does it mean to be a leader in a diverse society? What does it mean to be a healthcare worker in a diverse society? What does it mean to be an educator in a diverse society? And there's huge press for diversity in leadership and also the ability of all of us to function in diverse communities. So it intersects with for those of you, how many of you are faculty teaching? Good. So for anybody who has anything to do with curriculum and faculty, you see these topics intersect with our fields. 21st century fields in almost every one of these areas. It's about the kinds of knowledge and skills. It's about the viability of higher education to do what it's supposed to do. Now, quick run through what campuses typically do, right? So the rhetoric is increasing because our diversity is increasing, our student body diversity is increasing, our communities are more diverse. So the rhetoric increases, the list of identities grows, you've seen that. Programs and projects are growing. Every time we have an issue, we start a program. On many campuses who are not being intentional about this, the graduation rate disparities persist. And I should tell you, though, the research is really clear. When you pay attention, they go away. Amazing what education will do. If we think it's okay that your zip code predicts your outcomes, if we think that's okay, then we keep doing what we do. If we think that shouldn't matter, then we'll do good education. Now the challenge is that our human capacity The capacity of people who bring knowledge and capacity out on these topics is not growing. So faculty and staff diversity is not growing. So every time we say, oh, we're committed, let's do a program or project, we look around the table and look at the handful of people who have been at the table or are newly at the table, and we say, okay, now you do it. I don't know how many of Sharon's gray hairs are a function of that. The leadership on this topic comes from diversity roles. The one that I love is that the conversations and reports could be 40 or 50 years old. Often I read a report and I could go back and say, okay, what would this report have done differently 50 years ago? Not so much. And then we have competing views of whether progress is being made. So if I'm a leader, I stand up and I have to say progress, right? Your chief academic officer is not going to give a speech and say, oh, we're failing. You find the way in which we make progress and you report it. But now if I'm a member of a community that cares about diversity, I'm going to point all the ways in which we're not making progress. What we get is this. And when we get this, if I'm a leader, I think it's much more fun to start a partnership with the Glass Museum or open a new building. Much less grief. This is not a way to create change. In addition, diversity efforts are often parallel. We have diversity reports, we have diversity plans, often mobilized after a crisis. I'm not sure about here. You know, we have a crisis, somebody does something stupid, and then we all mobilize. We can't have conversations because they're difficult. So, you know, one of the things in this country, we've never been able to have very good conversations about race. And often our task forces, and I don't know if this is true here, just are faced with overload. You go to a meeting and you leave with more things to do. Well, most people who go to a meeting have things to do already. And now we have internationalization. It's amazing how well our campuses are mobilizing international initiatives, building campuses in Doha. We can't seem to pay attention to Tacoma, that kind of thing. So here's where I'm going. The next generation of diversity work reframed to be building institutional capacity for a pluralistic society. What does it mean to have the capacity as an institution to educate, do research, and serve as a pluralistic society? And really, it is about building capacity, building viability for that society. And here I want to just take a minute to think about technology, because it gets us out of the way we've traditionally thought about diversity work. And it reframes it in a way that I think is quite appropriate and quite exciting actually now. Think about when we understood that technology was an imperative in our world. Okay? Most of us, I think, believe it is an imperative, right? What did we do differently on our campuses? Can we just brainstorm a second? What's changed because technology has to be with us?
Well, our students have changed in the way they take in knowledge. We have online courses.
So the method of course distribution has changed. Students come with all this technology that we have to do. So communication has fundamentally changed. What else? Yeah.
We developed a student technology fee, so the students pay for the generation of student-oriented technology, and then we develop budgets that allow us to refresh administrative technology.
So you had a strategic way to figure out how to build your capacity because you knew you had to build your capacity.
Speed of information.
So speed. And what's really lovely about the technology parallels is it keeps changing. We never say with technology, I mean, some of us may feel this, but we never say with technology, when are we going to be done? Right? Now, here's another way in which we can understand it was an imperative. In the middle of the financial crisis, I don't know if you're still in the financial crisis or you're coming out of it.
Personally?
Personally, right. Every campus I know added a social media person, usually as part of PR or enrollment. So that you now have Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all of that stuff, right? So in the middle of the financial crisis, it was an imperative to build capacity to engage with social media. Well, why? Because the world had changed, yet again. And the institution knew that it didn't usually have people who knew what to do about that, or if they did, they were already doing things. Needed to build its capacity, hired real people. No excuses, no reasons, better do it. if we want to be 21st century prepared to function. Does that sound true? Mm-hmm. And just give you one more example. In the middle of the financial crisis, if you had a development officer, advancement person, who came to your chancellor and said, I can raise no money, look at the financial crisis we're in, what would happen to that person? They'd be fired. It's not that everybody would disagree that it was hard. Would be hard. We have, with diversity, more reasons than excuses why we can't do something. Mm-hmm. When we look at something like technology, it's an imperative. We may not be able to do it as well as we like, but we're going to do it because it's an imperative. And that's the thing I want you to take away. Whenever you have a conversation about technology, put diversity in and say, do we ever talk about diversity that way? Whenever you have a conversation about diversity, say, is this what we say when we talk about technology? When we understood that technology was an imperative, we had to make things happen. We built buildings with embedded Wi-Fi. You wouldn't go on a campus and not have that today. We have social media, etc. So it is very important that we try to think about the ways in which diversity is an imperative. Now, given the demographic shifts in our society, given the reality of our world, it is. But we don't act like it is. We act like it's optional, and then we behave like it's optional. So the next level of this work is going to have some key ways of thinking about it. And I'm going to go fairly fast here. The first is you've got to locate diversity as part of your mission as an institution. This isn't about my opinion or Sharon's values or your values, that you're lovely people who are committed to this. This is, why would this be important to this place? And theoretically, it ought to look different than some other places, right? So you have to begin the conversation about diversity saying, this is what we say we are. Why is diversity an imperative for us? It's got to be part of core indicators of success, not parallel. And I'll show you what I mean by that. It's got to be beyond projectitis. Every time someone says, let's do a program, that's not to say that programs aren't important and wonderful, but it can't be the first response to something, because then what you're going to do is collapse under the weight of all these programs, and meanwhile mainstream functions that are supposed to do work don't have to deal with diversity. One of the things that's come out of the research in this area has been we have to monitor progress. We have to know where we're doing well and where we're not. And we have to ask ourselves, how do we know? Because otherwise we get lots of stories and programs and descriptions. And because diversity now is about so much, it can be easily about nothing real in terms of real change. And it's got to be inclusive and differentiated. And here, I won't spend a lot of time on it, but what I mean by that is that lost list of identities that I mentioned. I want us to be inclusive. If I care about diversity in terms of underrepresented minority communities, why would I not care about somebody in a wheelchair and accessibility? And there I sort of call on Mandela and King, all of whom understood that if we understand these issues in one domain, we're going to be worrying about it in another. The difference is that not all these domains call on the same aspect of an institution. So if I'm part of a gay community, I may be concerned about domestic partner benefits, right? If I'm part of an immigrant community, I may be concerned about undocumented students. Gender identity communities have a lot of concern about gender-neutral bathrooms, right? So it's inclusive, but different elements are called. With respect to historically underrepresented communities, we are talking about student success, access, and we're talking about hiring historically underrepresented communities. That's not to say that lots of things don't bring lots of diversity, but where our unfinished business comes in terms of those communities. So it's inclusive and differentiated. So when people hand you the list and say, well, somebody from Brazil brings diversity, of course they do. That's not speaking to the unfinished business of historically underrepresented populations. So inclusive, yes, and differentiated. So this is some of your language. Serving the people of Washington. Well, okay, which people are you serving and how are you serving them? And unless we're willing to say, oh, we're only interested in the white middle-class population of Washington, which most people would not say, then serving the people of Washington is very real. If you disaggregate who the people are, you now say, well, who are we serving well and who are we not serving so well? Student success, including STEM fields, the sciences. Preparing all students for participation in leadership in a diverse society. Why do we want to have nursing students, teachers, business students go out into cities that are diverse without the competence to navigate that pluralism. Why do we think that's a good way to educate people? This is some of your language. It's a quote. You will achieve distinctiveness as an urban campus, access to exceptional education, interdisciplinary approach to knowledge in the 21st century, which, by the way, is characterized by diversity in this country, strong and mutually supportive relationship between the campus and its communities. So if I walked around to all the diverse communities, how do they feel about you? How well are you doing? How well are those partnerships developing? That's your mission. It's not my mission for you. I didn't make this up. This is you. You'll partner to improve the human condition. Well, God knows that these communities need improving. Well, what are you doing to partner to improve conditions? So whether it's economic health, education, health disparities, you contribute to knowledge that serves diverse communities. You seek out and support individuals who may experience barriers in gaining access. What a powerful mission. You serve as a catalyst for economic, technological, and community development. Well, again, which communities? Where are you doing that? And we know that that has to be in partnership, right? Aligns its values with actions in support of justice and fairness. Oh my goodness. So if I walked around and said, is this a place that does justice well? And how would we know it? That's your mission, not my language. Is that thunder? Attracts and retains a community of people and ideas representing diverse cultures and experiences. So when we go to think about excellence and diversity, so often excellence is one thing and diversity is something in a challenge to excellence, right? Because we have traditional metrics and we assume that somehow if we attend to diversity, we're going to weaken excellence. In this 21st century, excellence and diversity, in fact, not to pay attention to diversity is not to be very excellent. My favorite example in design is when airbags were designed that killed children. This is not excellence. If drugs are developed that kill African American males or heart drugs, that's not excellence in medicine. So what's true today is excellence and diversity are connected. So here is how I think about them. Student success. You care about student success? Yes? You don't care just about admitting people. So you're simply saying, disaggregated, how are different groups of students doing? Are they succeeding? And how would we know? Are all students being prepared? How do you know? How attractive is the institution to diverse groups and communities? That's excellent. I don't think you'd be happy saying, well, we have a terrible reputation in the African American community or the Native communities in the region. Are faculty and staff from different groups succeeding and thriving? So we know now today that the human capacity developed by faculty is very important. Well, which faculty are succeeding? Are they thriving? Do we have the capacity to identify, hire, and retain talent from diverse communities? When we understood technology was an imperative, it was amazing how we went around and got talent to help us, and we still do this, even if they didn't quite look the same as or didn't have the same credentials, because we knew we needed the capacity. So do we have that capacity? Does the curriculum and research address academic issues related to diversity? I just gave a little mini thing on identities. I'm a social psychologist by training. I don't think anybody who does any healthcare, nursing, psychological work should be coming out of school not understanding the complexity of identity. And I suspect it's not in the curriculum in many places. So do we have the right curriculum? And are we building the competence at all levels to engage this topic? Do we know even within our own faculty and staff groups can we come together? And do we have that climate? And I stuck on here just the metrics I love to see on any survey that asks about climate, not a special survey. How satisfied are you? Which communities are satisfied, which aren't? You could do this for students, staff, and faculty. Would you choose to come here again? It's a lovely question. Would you recommend it to a friend? So if I walked around and saw diverse communities of people, said, well, how is this place and would you recommend it to someone? It tells you a lot about how well you're doing with diverse communities. And do you perceive the place as committed? For all of this, faculty is key. Oh, Sharon's telling me to move in front. And I'm going to do this very quickly because there's a whole body of research, and if you have access to my book, there's a whole chapter on it. This is really important about faculty hiring because it's one of the least successful areas of our campuses. And I'll tell you about your data in a minute. When it comes to faculty hiring, there are more myths and assumptions about reasons for failure. So remember my comment about we have reasons for failure instead of imperative for success? So I could spend a long time. I've done a big national study on this. There aren't any. They wouldn't come here. We can't keep them. No? Sound familiar? Yeah. These are comments that infuriate people from these communities, and yet are the driving self-fulfilling prophecies that, you know, if I don't think there isn't anybody and they wouldn't come here, why would I spend much time looking for them? I mean, that'd be a fool's errand. So, myths and assumptions. What we know about faculty hiring is there's got to be leadership at every level: department, dean, chief academic officer, if this is going to happen, because it's really about interrupting usual practices. You know, that statement about the height of insanity is doing the same thing, getting the same results. Interrupting the usual practice, and I'll say what that is. So this is a quick summary of the research. Diversity is slow, this is national research. Slow to change. International growing the fastest. And there's nothing wrong with having international faculty, but on most campuses where I've disaggregated that, the international faculty has grown the fastest, and historically underrepresented communities flat or down. Where there is faculty diversity, it's often located in a particular department. Black studies, Chicano studies, Spanish departments in arts and sciences. This is the thing that gets me urgent. The next generation, and I wasn't able to get your data, so normally I have a lot of data to give you back, but it was hard to get data. But I am assuming this. The next generation has already been hired or is in the process of being hired. So there isn't 20 years to saunter through this anymore. We will have the next generation for a generation, and if it's not reflecting the diversity we need, you're going to be in trouble. What we know about searches: proactive, targeted searches. We know job descriptions matter. I've done studies on this. Some of these job descriptions look like they could have been written in the 1950s. And what we know is accountability matters. Everybody on our campuses is too busy. The last thing I want to do is a search process. I'd rather, as someone once said, post and pray and hope I get a diverse pool. I don't have time to do that. So we have got to make it important and imperative to do this in a different way. And this is just a quick chart that I just want to show you. The blue is a regular search. So this was a study I did to look at what are the conditions under which underrepresented minority faculty are hired. And the important bullet point here is light blue is a regular search, and this means you had diversity in the job description, target of opportunity hire, or a combination of the two. All right? Can you see the maroon? So this is African Americans, 14% regular search. So basically, if you want to diversify, you have to find talent, nurture it, and do something different, including in the job description. Look at the pattern for American Indians in this study. See any blue? What that says is our campuses are entirely incapable of identifying talent when it exists in a form different than the majority. Hiring for Latinos was better, but if I had, this included, the regular search included Spanish departments. So if I'd taken that out, it wouldn't have looked as good. Asian and whites had special hires. I mean, we use those techniques to hire, but regular searches work better. We have from the research something I learned from this work. Graduate students aren't just students. They're the pipeline to our faculty. And on most campuses, they don't look any more diverse than the faculty. Why? Because departments pick students. So this inability to identify talent replicates itself for graduate students. We have campuses who had one good year. We keep talking about it 10 years later. What I know about hiring is when it's optional, there will be little change. And it fundamentally is about identifying talent. So we're not in any way short-chasing excellence. It's just talent that may manifest itself in different forms. This is something that's very important in this work. Why is diverse leadership important? And it's terribly important that we have a more sophisticated understanding. So the research is really clear now. You can see down here role models. That's sort of our quick and dirty answer, right? We need a diverse faculty because we have diverse students. Well, we don't hire faculty to be role models. We hire faculty for their research, their expertise, their content, their teaching, right? Well, here's a whole list that if you want to have bad decision making, have no diversity around your table. When I look at the profile of some departments, I'd be scared. because it's all of the things we're not thinking about. The more diversity you have around the table, the more diversity you have in thinking about whether it's designing a study in a tribal community. We were talking earlier about all the ways in which academic work has just done damage, let alone been inadequate in certain communities. Well, if you don't have diversity around the table, you're not going to have that knowledge. Perceptions of commitment and equity. I'll tell you something about your data in a minute, and I would say you can use the rhetoric all you want, and I look at those numbers and I go, I'm not sure you're committed to diversity. We know it provides legitimacy. I mean, believe me, if you're the lone African American in a department and every time the department needs to go into the community, that lone African American is being dragged out to go talk about your diversity. It's not right if that's the lone person who gets dragged out every time. We know it brings new approaches in scholarship. There's a lot of evidence about that now. We know that it brings capacity with respect to communities that people are engaged in. If your mission has something to do with communities, then you need people who have genuine, deep relationships with communities to bring to this question of academic work. Your attractiveness. The reality is you don't have diversity around faculty. I don't care how much diversity you have in the student body. At some point, people look and say, it's not a place for me. And when it comes to hiring staff or faculty, it becomes a revolving door. You cannot be the only one. We know that the future leadership of higher education comes from the faculty. So if you want department chairs and deans and provosts and chief academic officers, we better have a diversity in a faculty. And here's something that's very important, the significance of the absence of zeros. The other night, I got some data from you. So there are 7 African American faculty members, these are assistant, associate, and full professors, in 4 of the 8 schools. There are none in 3, including education. There are 6 Latinos who are on the faculty in 3 schools. There are 0 in 5. None. 0. And there are no Native faculty. Maybe there's about to be 1. But now you see what I'm saying? Zeros. Zeros. Even in the national level, as difficult as our discourse is nationally, we know we can't have a Supreme Court with all white males anymore. There's a legitimacy issue. There's the absence of. We know that these folks are role models, that there's no question, but they're not only role models for their own communities, they're role models for everybody. Everybody needs to experience the diversity and talent at this level. And we also know about the burdens on tokens. You cannot function as a token. The burden is very real, and it's very hard for people to thrive. And my research now is taking me to looking at people stuck at associate, because once they get tenure, everybody says, oh, now you can be on every committee. And we have so few that they're on every committee. Well, now how are you supposed to do the kind of research that you're supposed to do to get promoted? Well, we're seeing it. People are getting stuck. So I'm going to move through this, but it is really not about programs and projects. It's about systemically embedding this throughout. It's about the curriculum. The intellectual work of diversity is critical. What does it mean to have a pluralistic society that works? We know that good education trumps background, and if I were to summarize volumes of research, high expectations, belief in students when they don't believe in themselves, and the support necessary to get them there. You can erase any disparities in student outcomes by a little intentionality, by a culture of success. And then you can be that model of a place that truly serves and provides access. And we know that domestic and international diversity are interrelated, but they're not the same thing. So I want you to look at these pretty quickly, because then I'm going to open question. But basically, so what do you do if you're doing a search? And this applies to staff and faculty, but it's particularly addressed to faculty. This cannot just be a department issue. We can't say to a department, go shake out that old job description, post and pray. This is about why is this department's work embedded in a school's work, and how is the school's work embedded in the University of Washington, Tacoma being successful in its mission. It can't be optional. Believe me, if we can take a shortcut and post and pray, we'll get the same results. If that's okay, if those zeros are fine, keep doing the same thing. The job description is critical. Academic work, what talent, what expertise are you looking for in this position? And I can tell you how diversity fits in a 21st century curriculum in every field. Even in physics. And I'm not talking about ethnophysics or ethnomathematics. Mathematics is my early background. But I want in that job description experience and success in working with diverse populations of students. Why shouldn't we expect faculty come with that experience? The minute you do that in a job description, you're going to get a more diverse pool. If you're really serious about attending to that, you're going to hire people who have capacity to do the work your mission is calling you to do. Search committee diversity we know works, except most campuses don't have the diversity to have the search committee, right? So you have to figure creatively about that. We know that targeted opportunities hire works. And on some campuses now, we've got targeted opportunities, and guess who's benefiting from it? If you look at the numbers, it's often white males who are spousal hires. Oh, great. Now we've created a system that would allow us to find talent and hire it, and guess who it's benefiting again? So, but we do know that if you create targeted opportunities, in other words, go find the talent. Go network in your community, your academic communities, and find fabulous people who would be delighted to work here. That's the way we can hire. My institution hired Peter Drucker, the guru of modern management. We didn't need a million Peter Druckers. We identified and brought him. It's about intentionality and commitment. It's not going to happen simply because we're lovely. It's going to take leadership. It's got to be an active search, networking. And fortunately, most of us live in embedded universes in our field, so we can network. We know how to do that. Search committee processes, the most current issue going on with search committees is training in implicit bias. What we now know is that everybody comes out of this society with biases built in. Doesn't matter who you are. And the research now is really clear that we can help people understand how they are biased. So the research, for example, that showed take the same resumes and head one with a African American sounding name and the other what would be considered a unusual name. White applicants who even had criminal backgrounds did better in being identified for the interview than those who had African American names. This is called implicit bias. People weren't walking around trying to be biased. This was true even within African American communities. The same has been shown with gender. You know, we just have implicit bias. We can train people how to understand that and to interrupt it. But implicit bias is part of what happens when we review resumes. Oh, this one went to a community college. This one started at Yale. So we have an elitism bias that goes on there. This is about identifying talent, championing people who've been identified, and making sure the pool is diverse. Data. You had to work really hard to get me that data so I could look at zeros. This is really important. Are we making results? We would, you know, you can't have a leader today who doesn't ask for budget metrics. Is the budget balanced, right? And basic metrics, simple things. Data is very important. This is some about retention. I couldn't tell whether you have as much of a retention issue as a hiring issue. There's an easy way to tell that, but I couldn't get the right data. But these are some of the points that go on to think about what goes on in the research on retention, where we can interrupt that as well. But again, it will be intentional. The more you say, well, we just do the usual thing and then we're going to try to diversify, I would bet money that you will not produce those results. And so if you're going to, it's going to be very much a matter of it being intentional. And here, you know, at the end of the day, people need to feel that they matter. People need support to navigate the academic process, just like students need to feel they matter and need support to navigate it. And what we know about diversity is none of our institutions are perfect, right? We're all making, the key here is to sustain the effort is that you perceive the institution as really committed, that it's making progress, that it honestly names the areas where it needs work, that we all do this collectively. That really matters for people being able to survive and thrive in our institutions. So this is the implications. Monitoring. I never thought that in the research I did that finding out that we need metrics and they must be monitored in the way that the budget is monitored. It's got to be central to your mission and not optional, the way technology is not optional. And it needs to be inclusive and differentiated so different groups are not pitted against each other. It's the most miserable feeling when we think, okay, we're doing hiring. Doesn't that person from Brazil bring diversity? Yeah, but that's not the main focus of what we're looking for here. We've got a lot of international perspective. This is about fundamentally what makes you attractive. I know no institution that doesn't want to be attractive. And finally, it's about urgency. You have, and I don't have your numbers, so I don't know for sure, but I'd bet some good money that you have already hired the next generation, a good chunk of it, maybe 60% in the last 15 years. So you have very little time in these next searches going along to make a difference for an entire generation that's only going to get more diverse. And all you have to do is look at public school demographics to say how much more diverse we will be. So let me stop there if I could, so we do have some time, and open it up just to reflection, any question, any concern, anything at all. Can we do that? I've rushed through, but I hope enough to give you provocative things to think about.
Well, I'm just going to say I think it's interesting just looking around to see who's here. I hope that this video will be shared so that folks, especially people in leadership positions who aren't here today, will have a chance to look at it.
Have we the choir?
Yeah. And I don't know how, in our earlier discussion, one of the things I had shared with Daryl is I think that on this campus, we're at a point where we need to be holding people accountable for some of the choices that they're making or not, and we haven't done that yet. I think when you were talking about how difficult it is to get the numbers on diversity, even the numbers themselves don't quite add up. And so there are questions about why that happens, and that's another story in and of itself. So I just have a question about this whole accountability thing. What can you do when people just keep doing the same old thing over and over again?
Here's what I would say. Accountability is absolutely critical. And part of the reason, let me just say, it's not, I study higher education and I'm a faculty member. It is not because I have embedded in me a bureaucratic hierarchical notion where I'm now the dictator and I get to tell you what to do. I don't want to live in that world, although sometimes with diversity I'd like to. But I do think we are so busy that posting and praying is an interesting metaphor for how we do searches, right? It takes time. So the question about accountability is critical. What I would say is, to the degree that we've got some of the choir sitting here, this means there's a good chunk of people in this room that are committed to this. What I would say, quite honestly, is I don't think the choir sings well enough. So I think this issue about locating this admission, why is this part of excellence? The ideal is you have leadership that will do that. Now, if I'm the chief academic officer, who is sitting here, and thank you, because that's a critical, on hiring, that's critical, right? You're in a transition for...
I'm glad you're here.
So here's what I want from most senior leadership. Everybody who reports to somebody should understand where diversity fits in their portfolio. It's actually quite a simple thing. So if I've got deans reporting to me, because I'm the chief academic officer, I want to have these data. If I'm in the interdisciplinary arts and science, I actually want to disaggregate by department, because my guess is most of the faculty of color in the school are in certain fields. So it scares me to think that my own field of psychology wouldn't have diversity, because I don't know how you do this work if you can't bring this kind of thinking to it. So part of it is a willingness on the part of leaders to say, this isn't okay, and begin to say, I expect it. Because what happens so much in our institution, particularly now with internationalization, is we say it, and then we move on to the stuff we're busy with. And what I know for myself, even as a faculty member, we can all read signals. This is either a serious imperative, as technology was, and all of a sudden all kinds of faculty came forward to do technology things. Why? We had mini grants. We provided staff support to get them up on the pedagogy. We had smart classrooms with real people who helped. So we communicated long and hard. So part of the issue is, whatever place we sit in the university, where are we communicating what's really important? Diversity cannot be one of a lovely list of service learning, right? So then we have to be monofocal about it. It's why campuses have developed chief diversity offices, to help keep the focus when people are kind of scattered. So at the top, you really want to hold people accountable. But I would say that the question is, who are the other people who will join in pushing? If you're the only Latino or African American in a department, believe me, you cannot be, without just feeling frustrated, the only person saying, where are we putting diversity in our job description? You've got to find other people who will say, this is an inadequate job description. It's 1950s, my field, social psychology. Why would we want to hire someone like that? So we all need to say, in our world, whatever it is, wherever we are, what are we doing? And so you actually have this kind of an approach. But I think accountability is key, and the metrics are key. It's not everything you ever wanted to know. I sit in a room and somebody said, be interesting to know. No, 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 no. What are the metrics by which we can all agree we will monitor progress? So if we have 4 domains of diversity, and it's access and success and climate for faculty, staff, and students, the curriculum, the research we do, and our institutional capacity, have key metrics on those. So we can say we're making really good progress on the enrollment of students from diverse communities. Or we're making really good progress on Latino students and Asian students, but not so much on Native students, whatever we can say. Well, then we can see it. And then we can turn to the areas where some work needs to be done and say, go do something. That metric issue is turned out to be more important than you could ever know. And you have to agree on it and do it. And I just finally got it for your current faculty, and it's not okay. And even the off-tenure faculty don't look more diverse. Too many zeros. It's embarrassing. And it sets you up for a lawsuit. So if you want to be risk averse, do something. Does that answer your?
Yeah. Can you say more about the access and excellence question? Because I think that's the last question I'll ask, but I think it's important. We started to talk about some this morning, but I know that it just seems to me on this campus that sometimes when we start to talk about access, people make the assumption that we're not talking about excellence.
Right.
And that, to me, is problematic.
Yes.
Whether we're talking about students or even faculty.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the notion is diversity, and if we do diversity, I just do the best, right? I just hire the best, or I admit the best, right? And the way I know the best are the metrics of the best, and with the students, it can be SAT scores. If you do I mean, I've done the retrospective studies. If you take success and go back and look at the distribution of the traditional metrics, you will see that particularly for historically underrepresented communities, but for many communities, there's very little to do with those metrics. So part of the issue is how will we understand excellence, right? And for me, the issue of high standards, but what we know is good education matters. So if you want to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now what's happened nationally is, it used to be that campuses could get away with just being more selective. And there's no question, if you've got high scores on everything, maybe you're wonderful. You're just probably coming from a particular community, right? So what's happened now nationally is the graduation rate imperative has become so strong, and it's going to be publicly acknowledged. And the assumption now has turned that on its head. It's the institution's responsibility. So the question of your mission, you provide access to people who may have experienced barriers to education. Isn't that your mission? So the issue is, okay, we bring in people who have very different trajectories for getting here. Our obligation is to be successful. And if we don't have the capacity and the faculty and staff to do that, then we're doing something wrong. And the problem, of course, is how do we keep that message? And that's where the leadership message is. And that's why the hiring and graduate student diversity is so problematic, because it's left at the department level with usual metrics. So medical schools are now saying, the MCATs have not predicted good clinical people. They've predicted good people to take tests. That's not what we need in doctors. So part of the issue is departments need to be held accountable to identify talent and expect that they will be successful, and not allowed to kind of flip it again and say, okay, well, if you just stop admitting those students. Now, I did look at your first-year persistence rates disaggregated, because this is one of the metrics, because 6-year graduation rate, you have to wait a long time. So this is from your report. So this was the average retention, 2005 to 2009, looked like first-year persistence. Now, again, the numbers can get small, so they'll bounce. 100% Native American. Looks like that's not a problem. But now you want to, so in other words, for that particular cohort, now that first year persistence is not enough. I'd like to see what happens second, third, ultimate graduation. Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander 74%, Latino 72%. So the place where there was the gap were Black and African American students. And what we know is institutions can make a difference, right? Cultural success. When campuses pay attention to historically underrepresented communities, part of that is diversity of the faculty, but part of it is just everybody expects people to succeed. We know from stereotype threat, we know from implicit bias, that people walk around going, if you expect me to fail, I might just get all anxious. So ironically, according to Claude Steele's work, the best students actually do less well. because they walk around assuming that you're going to assume that they're not going to do it well, because what's an African American male doing in physics, right? So you can do something about that. But you see, you've got some successes here. So you've got a bridge program with some successes. That's what I mean about these metrics. Let's call out our successes, because that's empowering, and not allow the myths to get. And that's, you know, there's no question that leaders have to matter here.
But then the myth is that the bridge kids, somehow they must be exceptional, and that's why they're succeeding.
Well, but
when people don't know who they really are.
So this is about the communication, right? Now remember,
communicate,
but remember, here's one thing I want to say that gets us in trouble. When technology was understood to be an imperative, there were naysayers. There are still naysayers. Your goal here is not to convert everybody to stand up and be that. When we understood diversity was an imperative, we had those folks who stand up in every faculty meeting or department meeting, tell you how the institution's going to hell in a handbasket, libraries will close, we're all going to be, right? And we moved on. You want to listen to see if there's something you should pay attention to. But we moved on. With diversity, every time someone, and there will be someone, stands up, we go, how do I convince them? The point here is institutional. If the bridge program is working, you should be communicating that. Will there be somebody who goes, well, maybe that's because you... No, that's not true if you want to look at the data. But we listen. We give such power to the... What happens is when an institution begins to move on change, and you've got mini grants that invite people to participate, I mean, mini grants for faculty are fabulous. Just say, we would like you to embed diversity in, here's a small grant. And guess what? We've had faculty say, I've seen the world in a different way and I'll never go back. So now you have more allies. And all of a sudden you sometimes find those little naysayers joining the, because it's about excellence. It is about excellence. Don't do anything that isn't about excellence. It's just a different form of excellence.
We have some guests here from another institution. UPS, does any of this sound like it might fit your institution?
We're from PLU.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just did the naughty thing, didn't I? I'm sorry. PLU, Pacific Lutheran University.
Oh, Pacific Lutheran.
So you can tell us about UPS too.
I'll try how they feel about that. Yeah, this echoes we've been giving each other looks across the table during Daryl's talk. It echoes with us as well in terms of the lack of diversity in faculty, and again the choir being the same people at the table and trying to move projects forward through task forces because we're all in the same task force together. Diversity committee that's poorly comprised and not tasked with any kind of power. And yeah. So.
Now, remember, the role of a diversity committee is to monitor, kind of look at the data and see where we're making progress, where not, and report on that. It is not to do the work of diversity. And that's what happens, right? So people stop coming. You know, if I'm a vice president of something, last thing I want to do is go to a meeting where I'm going to leave with 3 more jobs. So the issue is the eyes on helping the institution move forward. So if I'm the chief academic officer, my job is curriculum and faculty and blah, blah, blah. If I'm the chief student affairs officer, my job is these things. Student success happens to be something about everybody. And I don't worry about preaching to choirs. I just want the choir to start singing in multi-part harmony. I really mean that. Because I think we've used the same language, we do the same thing, we produce reports that are lovely, lots of programs. But at the end of the day, when I was coming here, I wanted to say, I want to know how you're doing with faculty, please. And you were having a hard time getting it. Well, that'd be like saying I can't get the budget figures. And there are campuses that a new president comes in and can't get budget figures, all hell will break loose, right? Because I'm being told as the new president that the budget is fine, and then I discover that we have this huge deficit. Well, so simple, elegant, how you doing? So that was my little breakdown for you, and you could do the same at your place. What is the count? What is the disaggregated graduation rates? And the reason people have been reluctant to talk about that is precisely what you were saying. The tendency to blame the community or the person, not say it's our responsibility.
I'm getting a couple of things kind of conflated, but
Yeah.
there's a reason for it. I was just thinking about the accountability question that Deidre asked, and we are moving forward in certain ways. You know, so for example, we now on this campus have a diversity designation where the students have to take a diversity course
Mhm.
once they graduate.
Right.
And so we have a lot of faculty that are trying to create courses that fit that need,
Mhm.
because they want to obviously attract people to their majors.
Mhm.
But there's a disconnect in that offering a diversity course doesn't necessarily mean that there's practicing the things that we're supposed to be teaching our students. And so, just to be candid, you know, some of our students are learning very, very well, you know, about, you know, structural racism, oppression, etc. But then they're experiencing it,
Right.
you know, with other people across campus, but there's not necessarily any accountability for the people who might be creating the very.
Well, and you know, the issue is none of our campuses are perfect.
Yeah.
And we may be really good on one of these identities and not so good on another, right? So I think the question is, what are the practices and processes in place for imperfect institutions? What we know is the more diverse your campus gets, the more likely you are to have outbreaks of bias, incidents, right? So the calling to a campus is two things. Don't just say, well, an anonymous person did it and we can't find them, which is what our campuses do. But rather say, this reflects the embedded issues in our society, and what are we collectively doing together? The issues recently about sexual violence against women that just reached the tipping point because campuses buried their heads in the sand, and now they're in the headlines. So I think the issue is it's never going to be perfect, but the more we have it aligned. So a diversity requirement is a check. The substantive work on that, so you, in my view, let that play itself out. For some people, medieval French is that. So then the question is, who approves those descriptions? What do we mean? I do think in an academic world, it is very important to let people see how diversity impacts their intellectual academic work. But I also think, given the inclusive and differentiated, that it's not just to say that, study abroad is actually a very important experience. We know that most first-generation students don't do it. I would say we should help students do it, right? But it's not to go study the exotic other somewhere. But you can begin to deal with inequities around the world and come back with a much more substantive view. So there are a lot of things that can take you down the path of just getting overwhelmed. So service learning. We now are beginning to see research that says you take a bunch of white middle-class students and send them into a poor community, they come out with more stereotypes. Well, that's a design question. So the question is, if you have enough diversity around the table, can we design this in a way that we really, in our gut, feel is going to work? So yes, there are lots of opportunities for disconnect. I do think the more capacity you build around the table, the more that group of people can have conversations, the more thoughtful the designs will be. But it won't be perfect. It just won't. And so part of the monitoring progress is to monitor where you are making progress so that you can focus your attention on the areas that need attention. And I think what happens now is diversity is just a long list of stuff that gets overwhelming.
So does that monitoring of progress should come from multiple places?
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
can imagine monitoring progress happening from a community or an advisory board of the community. And
Absolutely.
then monitoring progress comes from the diversity task force committee.
Absolutely.
And then, you know, in some different kind of way, a faculty committee should also be
Yes.
monitoring that progress. If we were going to see a much more comprehensive monitoring.
That's right.
Because I can imagine, and I think I've experienced in the last couple of years, is that when the diversity task force takes on the monitoring,
Right.
there's people don't hear.
Right.
So if there's multiple voices in that four-part harmony that we're talking about in terms of the monitoring,
Yes.
maybe that would help. But if there was only one, then that.
Right. Well, if it's the only place in the campus that's saying you're not making progress, and the leader, I think of the diversity task force as helping the senior leadership who have many things on their plate and don't keep this monofocal attention, that the diversity task force is the advisor to that. So if they're not paying attention, then the question is, well, who is your audience for it? But I also think the point you're making is very important, because at the institutional level, it's like budget. Can I use the budget example? Because it's really obvious.
Because people pay attention to budget.
Well, absolutely they do. So that's exactly right. So use that when you think about it. So at the senior level, you're not looking that the art department overspent its budget by $100. the vice chancellor for academic affairs or the business officer probably isn't monitoring that. There are key institutional level metrics. At the school, you're going down to a more granulated thing. And at the department, I'm watching who just replaced their computer. And that's also at the local level where you can have more qualitative things. Some of this, like the experiences of people or how people are reacting, or do we have an environment that's toxic? So someone speaks out and they get slammed, or do we have environments that invite people to say what they're experiencing? That get at the different levels, you can actually get more granulated stories that go with that. But even the data at this level have a story. And it is about making meaning of the data. But absolutely, perceptions of the community. Well, we're probably not going to survey the community, but how do we understand how this institution is perceived? Well, now with social media, we get some perceptions about how some communities perceive us. So yes, absolutely. And it may well be that the Diversity Task Force also listens for these things as well and puts that in as part of their story. But what it cannot be is the Diversity Task Force can't be the place where someone says, well, what have you done for diversity? I want to look at everybody's role. So if I went around this room now and said, take your role, I don't care what it is, where is diversity embedded in your work? Now, there may be things that I'm being asked to do that I don't know how to do. That's where you've got a diversity resource center, you've got wonderful expertise where you can go and say, help. So if I'm a department and I really don't know how to do this, there are people here who do, and they can ask for help. But it should be in everybody's portfolio. And we know how to do that. We've done it with internationalization. I don't know if you have, but we've done grants, and all of a sudden the curriculum is flourishing with respect to internationalization. And meanwhile, Tacoma is not necessarily part of it. So absolutely, multiple levels, but it's got to be aligned, and it can't just be stuff. Otherwise, it'll be too much.
Let's have one more question, and then we'll sort of shift our session to more one-on-one. Any burning question here?
It was about the MOUs.
Oh, yes, yes.
With the departments.
Yes.
from the departments.
Yes.
What-
Oh, thank you. Yes, and that's something that came actually from a campus experience. A campus was having a terrible time with retention. Asked me to come in, and they had all the reasons why people were leaving that had not to do with them.
Is that
And
faculty retention?
yes, faculty retention. So I interviewed all the people who left, and I got an earful. People in tears about their experiences at this place and didn't want to leave. But you also heard about toxic departments. And one of the levers for change is people want to hire. That's a place you get faculty attention. But some of these departments don't know how to keep people and have them thrive, right? So what began to evolve was an MOU notion that if a department is going to get permission to search, they are going to lay out some ground rules about what they are going to do when someone comes. That includes mentoring. In some cases, I really do think if it's a toxic environment, and everybody knows it, everybody knows which departments are not functional, then it requires a dean or a vice chancellor to say, you're not getting a search until you figure this out. If you've got a bully in your department that bullies people, we're not bringing anybody new in it. Why would we do this? So the MOU is a way for the department to say, here's how we're going to have that person's experience be a good one. Here's our obligation to this person. And I think it's a wonderful idea because it sort of lays very concretely responsibility for the health and well-being of a new colleague. And I think particularly where you've got one, all these ones and zeros, to bring someone in is to say, how are we going to have feel like their research matters? Not that they're the token symbol that we parade every time it's convenient, but rather we're going to embrace, we value this person, they matter, and here's what we're going to do to make sure they thrive. And I think it's a wonderful idea. But what do we do? Someone says that, and we usually ask departments to create a request for a line. I assume you do that? Okay, so what are we going to do to make sure that when we hire someone, they succeed, particularly if they're an underrepresented person?